In this video, we'll compare options for split toning within RAW versus equivalent methods in Photoshop. There is no split toning method in Photoshop, but there are equivalent things you can do to achieve the same result of biasing the highlights and shadows towards a particular color. So let's start with image 8563. We'll make one raw adjustment, and that is to bring the shadows all the way up, not because they look great here, but just so we can see some shadow detail and understand what's going on with these tools as we work with them. Let's also take a look at our tone curve and just bring up the lights a little bit, just adding a little bit more drama to this image, closer to the way it might look. So around 45 or so on the lights and plus 100 on the shadows. Leave the split toning alone here. We'll do that over in Camera Raw once we get to Photoshop. Right click the image, choose Edit in, Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. Once we're inside Photoshop, let's create a few copies. Right click, New Smart Object via Copy once, do it again, and let's label these as Original. We'll call it our Raw Edit. And this top layer, hit Command G, create a new group. So it's in there, we'll call this our Photoshop edit for this layer. So let's start with the raw edit. If we double click on this smart object, we'll open up the Camera Raw interface. We want to look for this little two bars icon for split toning. And within it, we're just going to play with the highlights here. And let's leave the hue at 0. So we're going to be adding a red cast. But if you want to figure out which hue, hold the Alt or Option key and then click on this slider. And as you move through, you'll see a simulation as if you're at 100% saturation. So it's a very easy way to pick your preferred color, and you can see the result at different areas. But I think that is a pretty good color option. Although, well, let's go ahead and try around 25 or so. It's going to make things a little tougher to match because now we don't have a direct shade, but that is the best looking color. Let's bring up the saturation to maybe around 50 here. So we're at 24 hue, 50 saturation, click OK. And look from the original to afterwards. It's done a nice job of adding a lot of color to the sky there. It's also done a great job of keeping our shadows unaffected. There's no color cast being thrown into these shadows. So now let's take a look at our options in Photoshop. There is, of course, no split toning option in Photoshop other than the ability to go up and go to Filter and then choose Camera Raw Filter. So you could apply it to a smart object or another layer that way. And that's a very good option in Photoshop. If you do that, the results are going to look very similar here. We could go and throw that in now. We get a very similar result. So if you want to match that, you can do that way. But I want to show you a few other options in Photoshop. One of them is going to be the color balance layer. So if we click on a new color balance layer and open it up, notice that you have the ability to target by shadows, midtones, and highlights. Of course, we want to pick the highlights here. And now we're going to push up some red in there as well as some yellow because there's a bit of an orange cast. And notice as we turn this on and off, the sky has improved, but we've put significant color into the shadows. But why is that? We've picked the highlights. The reality is, even though this tool says that it's targeting shadows, midtones, and highlights, it's simply biasing the result towards them. An adjustment of the highlights affects all the tones in the image, including some very dark shadows. Conversely, adjusting your shadows also affects very bright things in the image. It doesn't seem to be getting to the brightest highlights here, but very close to it. So you can see that this tool is not as precise as it might sound. But there is a way you can work with that. So we've got this adjustment that looks nice in the sky. We simply want to block it from the shadows. Well, this is a great place to use a blend if. You can double click on the layer and move the underlying layer sliders to kind of knock out the sky. Be sure to hold the Alt or Option key to split your sliders. And now you can get this quick adjustment that targets just those tones. And I love using blend if on a color balance in order to do split toning or color grading. I'm going to cancel that here and show you how you do that within Lumenzia. Simply go up, choose the Blend If under Mode, and then you can click on a light selection to target the lights. And you can see here that it's targeting the lights, and there's a little bit of spill to the brighter parts of these shadows. So you could either advance to a Lights 2 to be more targeted there, and that looks pretty good. Conversely, you could also say not darks, which is not the same thing as lights. They're not inverses. And notice now that the impact of the shadow areas is pretty minimal. So that's also a good option. Either way, you have multiple different blend ifs that you can explore for the lights, the shadows, as well as midtones if you want to target your midtones. Now, in comparing these two methods, obviously there's a lot more color in what we've done in the raw, so let's push up the results here quite a bit. We'll go back to our highlights, and I'm going to increase the strength of this adjustment pretty considerably. We won't get an exact match, but let's just see if we can get it to be relatively close. And what I'm seeing here in the color balance is brighter and more red. So what if we try the preserve luminosity mode? Well, it obviously does something kind of unexpected. It changes the luminosity in a way you wouldn't expect. Looking at the underlying image, it seems to be brightening it up. But in this case, it is kind of a nice result. So this can be a neat way of exaggerating sun bursting through a scene. But let's turn it off here just to try and match things for the moment. Go back to our highlights, and let's just see from underneath to here. Probably need a little bit more yellow tones to it, even more red. And that's getting fairly comparable. At this point, I might simply just knock down the opacity a little bit for the sake of matching. And again, this is guesswork. So there does not seem to be an area where I'm going to get the same result here. Notice as I knock down the opacity, I get to a point where the color is not as significant. So what's happening is the color balance is affecting the luminosity of the image in a pretty considerable way. We could switch over to the color blend mode and compare those. And that is a little bit closer, but still seems to have a different luminosity in the center here. Let's bring this result back a bit. So that's about as much time as I want to spend to match these, but they're getting pretty close. And ultimately, I like the result from Photoshop better. Notice the center here is pretty much the same shade of pink going out. It doesn't have as much of a feeling of fire radiating out in the center of the sky here, whereas the Photoshop edit does have more of that. It's very, very subtle, but I think that's a nice touch, and having less saturation in the center there actually enhances this result. Now, these clouds I don't maybe like as much here, so I'm not going to say that one's necessarily better than the other, but it is important to note that these different approaches give you different options. And if you want to do split toning in Photoshop, one way of doing it will be a color balance adjustment combined with a blend if. Now that's not the only way you can do it, so let's hide this and take a look at another option. Going back to our normal options in Lumenzia here, we could also use a solid color layer. We'd want to use it in color blend mode. So just hold down the Command or Control key, click on that, we'll get a solid color layer, and now we can specify the color. The hue before, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think it was close to 25. So let's just go with that. Say OK. And obviously that's pretty dramatic, but let's just bring down the opacity of this layer until we get something that's probably more in the range we want. And then just like we did before, we're just recoloring the whole image with this. Let's go and add the same blend if on it. So actually I'm going to switch back to the blend if under mode and do the same not darks mask on it. And you can see now that we're adding this color to the sky here. And it's okay, I like it. It could be a pretty good result. If we compare that to the underlying adjustment we made before, it is a different color, so let's make this a little bit more red. We'll click on the hue and bring it down to more of a reddish value and see if we can't get a better match here. It is a little bit washed out, so we'll bring up the opacity, maybe not quite that much. And it also seems to be more targeted in the central areas. Notice these corners are not as much, and I kind of like that result. So maybe we should try a different blend if. We can switch over to something like Lights 2, and let's compare these. That is a lot closer, so we had to be more targeted to the highlights. But that's the power of the blend if, is where you can choose where things go. And let's now kick up the opacity because we've used a more restrictive blend if. we need to put a little more color through it. And the Photoshop result looks pretty good. Again, I like the center, the way it's a little bit lighter in this image. Notice that we're painting color everywhere, including these areas here. So you could add a layer mask to further control this layer and be more precise. The thing about this is you're just simply replacing color. At this point, it's going to be 65% and then further reduced by the value of the blend if. So there is some of the original color in here, but it is overpowering that color. So between the solid color approach and the color balance, I think that the color balance looks better. Let's actually put them head to head. So I'm going to duplicate the whole group. And in the top one, we'll do the solid color, and the bottom one has color balance. And comparing these, this to me looks quite a bit nicer. So most of the time, I will ultimately use a color balance layer with a blend if I'm going to adjust color in Photoshop. I do use both approaches. I think adjusting in RAW can be a great way to go. And if you have a Camera Raw object, you can of course change it on the fly from Photoshop. But if you haven't done it in RAW, the color balance option really is a great way to go and ultimately gives you more flexibility because of the use of the blend if and the ability to target midtones, not just highlights and shadows. It does have more flexibility. So I would encourage you to at least understand how to use color balance. It is a great tool. You could, of course, also look at a few other ways of adding color. One of them would be just simply putting a blank pixel layer and painting on it in color blend mode, which would be similar to what we've done with the solid color. But instead of painting one color across the whole sky, you could paint slightly different shades in different areas if you wanted to get very fancy. Or we could take a look at some of the other options within here. Photo filter would be probably a good one to use, which also could let you warm things. So let's take a look at that for a moment. So with photo filter, we can now bring up the density, and of course we're warming the sky, or we can choose different types of warming filters or pick a color. So if we wanted to go back to that reddish kind of color we did before, we're getting this warming effect in the sky. Let's go back to our blend if, put a lights to blend if, and that's what you're getting with a photo filter. So there are multiple different ways you might apply split toning within Photoshop, but the way to do it with all of them is going to be with a blend if. And I would definitely recommend a blend if over creating a luminosity mask for two reasons. One, the blend if is going to add nothing to the size of your file. And secondly, if you change anything in the underlying layers, the blend if dynamically adapts to it. You don't have to recreate the mask. And ultimately, I don't see any real quality advantage to using a luminosity mask in this case. You can, of course, adjust the luminosity mask in a lot of additional ways, but for color grading or split toning, I don't usually find a lot of advantage. So blend if is a really nice tool to use in this sort of situation.